Abraham Lincoln, a man known to be of the highest honor for being a political other in the sense of his liberal ideologies and anti-slavery sentiments in the 18th century, has left a legacy beyond the effect of his time. There are quite literally still people who want to continue his party legacy, which, whenever you consider the circumstances of the 1800s being slavery and his Whig Party affiliation, this is a bit of a reach, but the sentiment of his power certainly still holds. Perhaps what they wanted to prolong is the posterity of his character and the more intrinsic and personal values that made him such a sought-after ideological figure. In the vacuum that is Lincoln's life before he took political office, a space devoid of definitive indicators or motivations, historians are left to scrape up clues from his adolescence and cues from his interactions in order to try and determine the root of his platform as an abolitionist. These clues leave us with some framework, though substantial, that we can attempt to fill through the places he's lived and surroundings, his position as a war president, and simple philosophy towards man as a sentient being. So without further ado, the creation and cultivation of an abolitionist during the Civil War. Before we go into Lincoln's slavery platform at all, I first have to discuss a common discrepancy within his beliefs. Lincoln did not fight against inequality or even fight for African American rights. In fact, he typically opposed them. Lincoln was actually of the belief that in terms of things like marriage, education, and other general facets of human rights, that African Americans weren't even on the same plane as whites. What Lincoln fought, however, was slavery. He simply opposed the idea that any man be in the same state that African American slaves were in, or the conditions that they endured throughout the 18th century. The reason I mention this is because the reason that it's so hard to find primary source evidence based in Lincoln's ideas on black rights or equality is because he didn't support either. He simply was opposed to slavery, and if slavery is an abomination against human rights, this was simply collateral. An abolitionist at the core and an activist for human rights as a secondary motivation. To begin to look into his policy, however, we can look into the information that we have on his surroundings as an adolescent, namely his birthplace, Kentucky. This is a source of confusion for a lot of people, as Kentucky was a border state who in the 18th century, didn't exactly look like it was going to head towards the abolishment of slavery at all, and actually was comprised of 1/5 slaves. However, what does make more sense is his move from Kentucky to Illinois. Illinois saw substantially less slavery than Kentucky, so as a young adult, there's a lot to gather from his surroundings and the norms that he saw between the two different states that he lived in. Eric Foner, one of the greatest historians to write of Lincoln, outlines this in the first chapter of his book, The Fiery Trial. He lays out Lincoln's natural inclinations towards anti-slavery sentiments and then goes to state, the clash between societies based on slave and free labor would come to dominate American life and shape the mature Lincoln's political career, connecting Lincoln's adolescence with his philosophy of man as a free being, which I will be discussing later in this talk. However, this is a minute piece of the Lincoln puzzle, and there is a lot of illumination that we can gain from later events in Lincoln's life. One of these illuminating events is Lincoln's trips to New Orleans from 1828 to 1831. He takes a series of flatboat trips to New Orleans, and for obvious reason, this changes things for young Lincoln and the way that he sees the world. His eyes were opened ever so abruptly to slavery in its most pure and extreme form, and along with the places he lived, events like this can help us start to see the ideology that he's known for. John Hanks, who attended these trips with Lincoln, states that, "We saw Negroes chained, maltreated, whipped, and scourged. Lincoln saw it, his heart bled. I can say knowingly that it was on this trip that he formed his opinions of slavery." But to what extent? How far can we assume the influence of these trips when they're the only pieces of evidence that we have? How can we truly assume that one extreme exposure to slavery in Lincoln's early life pushed him to reform America and the construct it built throughout the years of its slavery? No. What we can do, however, is begin to look at Lincoln's presidency and what it actually meant as a historical marker, a war president. Once Lincoln delved into politics, it became evident that a lot of his policy would be implemented in order to navigate the Civil War and eventually end it. Entering his presidency, Lincoln is immediately faced with the challenges embodied by war, and this creates a platform that has little to do with anything else. This sort of seclusion of intent, however unintentional, really pushes Lincoln's policy into what it is. The sheer dichotomy of the Civil War would force any leader to a side, and Lincoln, being a Union man with the goal of defeating the Confederacy on a more technical and methodical level, forces his policy into something conducive with the Union's goals, anti-slavery. From a less substantive and more minimalist definition, Lincoln's policy and the institutions that come from it as byproducts are simply created in order to strengthen both his ability to stifle the South's power and gain Northern votes and remain the incumbent leader of America. Lastly, we can examine Lincoln's philosophy about man and his intrinsic values as a source of understanding for his anti-slavery platform. Lincoln has a very Emersonian view of man and believes heavily in the ideals of independence and free will, which is clearly opposite of the views of slavery. Even in terms of his presidential policy, Lincoln states that the free will of the people is superior, and if they were to wish to act with deliberation for the establishment of peace at the expense of their country, that he is not able to stop it, nor does he have the right to do so, highlighting his belief of the sentient power that man holds. In 1864, at his speech to the 164th Ohio Regiment, Lincoln states, "We have, as all will agree, a free government, where every man has the right to be equal with every other man. In this great struggle, this form of government and every form of human right is endangered if our enemies succeed." An exemplification of Lincoln's epithet. Simply put, Lincoln viewed all sentient beings as deserving of freedom. In conclusion, Lincoln was a widely loved and widely misunderstood political figure in America. So loved, frankly, that I'm sure if I presented any of this information to some of the current Lincoln enthusiasts, I'm sure they'd remain in blind belief that his abolitionist stance comes from a place of altruism, nature and no nurture. However, there's a lot of information in Lincoln's life that we can use to truly and more realistically map out the mechanisms of his platform. Starting with his childhood and his surroundings, we can see how influential his upbringing was, followed by an elaboration of what his policy had to be in order to navigate the Civil War, and a brief look into Lincoln's philosophical ideals and how they molded and guided his policy into what we see and what our children will see for the remainder of history. But to conclude this talk, I hope to bring more light into the baffling creation and cultivation of an abolitionist during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln. Thank you.